Hello, I'm M. Mark. Thank you for coming out on this cold night to help us celebrate the work of PEN and the continued existence of PEN America. The journal I started 9 years ago when I was a trustee of PEN and wanted to find a way to help and serve this excellent organization. It's appropriate, I think, and more than a little thrilling, to be here on the stage of the Great Hall of Cooper Union, the site of so much of importance in the history of the struggle of workers and the women and the civil rights movement. Our work at the PEN Journal is given shape and meaning by the work of our colleagues. PEN, as many of you know, I'm sorry, I'm just getting over flu season up at Vassar College. As many of you know, PEN defends freedom of expression around the world in our own country, fights violations of human rights, encourages racial and ethnic diversity, sends writers into schools to make literature available to those who might not otherwise have access to books, and organizes writing workshops for youngsters who someday hope to publish books of their own. We also give literary prizes, and since 2005, we've brought writers from around the globe each spring to the PEN World Voices Festival. Those of us who put the journal together attempt to document and extend the reach of the excellent work that PEN does. We also elaborate on this work and allow ourselves the pleasure of literary excursions that echo and reflect the goals of the organization. Our heroic managing editor, David Haglund, and stalwart editorial board, many of whom are out there, are preparing to send the 10th issue of PEN America to the printers. I want to express my gratitude to this wonderful editorial staff, and also to Elizabeth Weinstein and Kara Llewellyn, who organized this evening's festivities. And from the heart, appreciation to the writers who fill our pages, and especially those who have agreed to help us out tonight. So get ready to experience the power of their words. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Francine Prose. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? How about that? If I pull the microphone in? Okay. I'm going to read a selection from a story called Canned Foreign by Yoko Tawada, which appeared in PEN America issue 6, Metamorphoses. Yoko Tawada was born in Tokyo in 1960. She's written novels, poems, short stories. She's won numerous literary prizes. Canned Foreign is from the short story collection Where Europe Begins, translated by Susan Bernofsky. Susan Bernofsky is, I thought, only a brilliant translator from the German, but now, as you're about to hear, she's also a very gifted translator from the Japanese. In any city, one finds a surprisingly large number of people who cannot read. Some of them are still too young. Others simply refuse to learn the letters of the alphabet. There are also a good many tourists and workers from other countries who live with a different set of characters altogether. In their eyes, the image of the city seems enigmatic, veiled. I already knew the alphabet when I arrived in Hamburg, but I could gaze at the individual letters for a long time without recognizing the meaning of the words. For example, every day I looked at the same posters beside the bus stop but never read the names of the products. I knew only that one of the most beautiful of these posters, the letter S, appeared 7 times. I don't think this letter reminded me of the shape of a snake. Not only the S, but all the other letters as well differed from live snakes in that they lacked both moisture and flesh. I repeated the S sounds in my mouth and noticed that my tongue suddenly tasted odd. The woman I met at this bus stop had a name that began with S, Sasha. I knew at once she couldn't read. Whenever she saw me, she gazed at me intently and with interest, and she never attempted to read anything in my face. In those days, I often found that people became uneasy when they couldn't read my face like a text. Most of the words that came out of my mouth had nothing to do with how I felt. But at the same time, I realized that my native tongue didn't have words for how I felt either. It's just that this never occurred to me until I'd begun to live in a foreign language. From our bus stop, one could see not only the various billboards, but also the signs for a few restaurants. One of them belonged to a Chinese restaurant called the Golden Dragon. 2 Chinese characters shone gold and green. The first character meant gold, and the second, dragon. I explained once to Sasha as I saw her staring at this sign. Sasha then pointed out that the second character was even shaped something like a real dragon. And in fact, it is possible to see the image of a dragon in this character. The little box in the upper right-hand corner might be a dragon's head, and the lines on the right side reminded me of a dragon's back. But Sasha knew it wasn't a picture of the dragon. She asked me whether I, too, could write it. A few weeks later, Sasha showed me a teacup and said she discovered the dragon symbol on it. Indeed, the cup did bear this sign. Sasha had seen it in a shop and immediately bought it. For the first time in her life, she could read. Then I wanted to teach her some more characters. She'll always be illiterate since she can't read the letters of the alphabet, but now she can read one character and knows that the alphabet isn't the only system of writing in the world. Once, in a supermarket, I bought a little can that had a Japanese woman painted on the side. Later at home, I opened the can and saw inside it a piece of tuna fish. The woman seemed to have changed into a piece of fish during her long voyage. This surprise came on a Sunday. I had decided not to read any writing on Sundays. Instead, I observed the people I saw on the street as though they were isolated letters. Sometimes 2 people sat down next to each other in a cafe and thus briefly formed a word. Then they separated in order to go off and form other words. There must have been a moment in which the combination of these words formed quite by chance several sentences in which I might have read this foreign city like a text. But I never discovered a single sentence in this city, only letters and sometimes a few words that had no direct connection to any cultural content. These words now and then led me to open the wrapping paper on the outside, only to find different wrapping paper below. Thank you.
Hi, how is this? Still good? Yeah. I'm Lydia Davis, and I will be reading a very short text by Borges in the spirit of the wonderful and rare international embrace of the PEN organization and its magazine. I will first read the title in Spanish. Borges y yo. This is, I could read the whole thing if you like, but it wouldn't be terribly pleasant for some of you. This is translated by James P. Albee. Borges and I. The other one, the one called Borges, is the one things happen to. I walk through the streets of Buenos Aires and stop for a moment, perhaps mechanically now, to look at the arch of an entrance hall and the grill work on the gate. I know of Borges from the mail and see his name on a list of professors or in a biographical dictionary. I like hourglasses, maps, 18th century typography, etymologies, the taste of coffee, and the prose of Stevenson. He shares these preferences, but in a vain way that turns them into the attributes of an actor. It would be an exaggeration to say that ours is a hostile relationship. I live, let myself go on living, so that Borges may contrive his literature. and this literature justifies me. It is no effort for me to confess that he has achieved some valid pages, but those pages cannot save me, perhaps because what is good belongs to no one, not even to him, but rather to the language and to tradition. Besides, I am destined to perish definitively, and only some instant of myself can survive in him. Little by little, I am giving over everything to him, though I am quite aware of his perverse custom of falsifying and magnifying things. Spinoza knew that all things long to persist in their being. The stone eternally wants to be a stone, and the tiger a tiger. I shall remain in Borges, not in myself, if it is true that I am someone. But I recognize myself less in his books than in many others, or in the laborious strumming of a guitar. Years ago, I tried to free myself from him and went from the mythologies of the suburbs to the games with time and infinity. But those games belong to Borges now, and I shall have to imagine other things. Thus, my life is a flight, and I lose everything, and everything belongs to oblivion or to him. I do not know which of us is writing this page.
The pretty girl to my left is the very fine young American playwright Sarah Ruhl. I write plays too, and my name is Edward Albee. We're reading this evening briefly from a play called Theremin by Petr Zelenka, translated by Stepan Simak with the help of a grant from the Penn Translation Fund. The scene is a radio station in New York City, October 24th, 1929. Leon Sergeyevich Theremin is a Russian inventor, musician, and industrial spy. Radio host Billy Watts is set to interview Theremin about an instrument he invented that uses radio antennas to make eerie electronic music.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Billy Watts, and you are listening to WZY Radio New York. My guest tonight is Leon Sergeyevich Theremin. He came to us directly from Russia, and some of you may actually know his face from posters and newspaper cartoons. In any case, I think it is safe to say that his presence here in New York has been the cause of much excitement. Good evening.
Good evening.
What we want to do here tonight is to introduce your musical instrument, the Theremin Vox, to a wider public. All I will say is that it's the only non-contact musical instrument in the world, and that one plays it by pulling the sounds, one could say, literally out of the ether. Am I correct?
More or less.
The RCA Victor Company is the manufacturer, and the instrument will be available in stores sometime next month. I have one of their trial models here in the studio, and I do have to admit that it is a very unusual musical instrument, to say the least. But I think I've said enough. I'll let Professor Theremin talk.
Of course, we're talking here about an experiment. But if the instrument takes off, it could mean a complete change in the general approach to music.
In what regard?
Well, the theremin is a very democratic musical instrument.
What do you mean by that?
It's an instrument that can be played by just about anybody.
And other instruments can't?
Not really. Let's assume that the Russian Revolution in 1917 abolished inequality between people in Russia. Probably not entirely in practice, but certainly in theory. What followed was land reform, collectivization, and the nationalization of industry.
Mr. Theremin, this is a Catholic radio station.
Of course, of course. But we still have to deal with the last remaining inequality between people: talent. If we're to draw the argument about inequality to its logical conclusion, we must consider talent as something that continues making people fundamentally unequal.
This is a very remarkable idea.
So, from that point of view, it is obviously ridiculous to leave music making solely in the hands of a small group of talented and heretofore somewhat unfairly chosen artists.
Are you seriously proposing that even those who don't have a God-given gift should have the right to make music?
Exactly. That's the philosophy of our instrument. The theremin vox marks the end of the aristocratic understanding of music making. It will erase the difference between the virtuoso and the occasional hobbyist.
And you seriously believe this?
I do. Take me, for example. I came here tonight to this studio in order to play the theremin for you and your listeners, yet I personally have absolutely no musical talent whatsoever. As a theremin player, I'm average at best.
Really?
Our electronic orchestra has 4 members, and only one of them, Joseph Sillinger, has actually studied music. All the others are self-taught people who don't have any musical talent and yet who play regardless. They play simply because they decided to play.
And your electric orchestra is successful?
Well, judging by the thousands of people who see our concerts.
Which at the same time function as communist gatherings.
A revolution in music must, by definition, be a political revolution as well.
So you could imagine a world where every bank clerk or stevedore simply comes home after work, plugs his theremin or a similar electrical device into a socket in the wall, and begins to play music, which then spills out of the window and fills the street with sound?
I can.
Are you sure?
Well, maybe you're right. It may not be possible without God.
Is that so? Well, I think we should just go ahead. Be my guest, Mr. Theremin. The radio waves are yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Chernow. The prison writing program has been mentoring writers in prison since 1971, and PEN America has, starting with its very first issue, included pieces by these writers in its pages. Now, these poems, stories, and essays sit side by side with writing by acclaimed authors from around the world. We don't kind of segregate these people or kind of stigmatize them by putting them in some separate literary ghetto. We consider them part of the larger literary community that we serve. I'm going to read the last few pages of a work of fiction by Chris Everly, who currently resides in the Arizona State Prison Complex, where he is both an active writer and, believe it or not, a student of theology. This story was published in issue 9 of PEN America. To set up the story, it's set in the 1980s. The narrator has gone on a modest vacation with his family to the Hamptons, if such exists, and they stay there in a rickety cottage that was once the town jail. The narrator finds his thoughts keep returning to the subject of imprisonment in all its many forms. The story is called Hook Island Traveler. The mothers I knew as a boy would speak of certain loud and brassy girls as jailbait. A skirt worn too high above the knee, a blouse unbuttoned too far below the throat, a sultry way of laughing from the belly or toying with the shoulder-length hair was enough to identify the species. Before I was old enough to feel the gravity of girls, I puzzled over how such bait could land a boy in jail. Were males mere fish to rumble at female hooks? Later, my blood put an end to this puzzling, and I would glance furtively at the dangerous hussies, fearful that a direct stare would hurl me headlong behind bars. My father's father had been a prison warden in Ohio for a spell, and Grandpa told me dark tales of that place. The inmates wore dingy overalls striped with black, as heavy as canvas, and they left their cells only to exercise and to break stones for highways. Every man's name was entered into a logbook, and if he died before parole, his name would be crossed through with an inky line. Riding by prisons in the family car, I often saw the arms of prisoners thrust from windows, languid pale arms waving like tentacles of undersea creatures. During our week on Hook Island, I avoided the news, figuring the world at the end of our vacation would be in the same sticky mess. But one morning, I picked up the New York Times to find out how the dismal Yankees were doing. I should have quit after reading the box score, but I browsed the rest of the paper. My eye fell on an article about the crunch in American prisons, and a few numbers got stuck in my head like cockleburrs. 1 out of every 35 men was either in jail or skulking about under the suspicious eyes of parole officers. American blacks were imprisoned at a higher rate than any other group anywhere else in the world. During the week of our vacation, 1,000 more of our fellow citizens would be locked up. I folded the paper away and suggested that we all go blueberrying. I love that gerund, blueberrying. We drove across Mather's Bridge off the island and through the back roads, scanning the woods, and eventually found a good patch of bushes along the rusty iron fence of a cemetery. Long before my plastic bowl was filled, I quit picking berries and went strolling among the lichen-spangled tombstones on the lookout for queer inscriptions. The only other visitor was a man who sat in his car near the center of the graveyard with his tattoo arm crooked out the window. His radio was blaring, but I could only make out a mumble of talk. As I drew near the car, I recognized the voice of a retired admiral testifying before Congress about his role in the conduct of a secret war which he and some cronies inside and outside the government had been carrying on in various bleeding corners of the world. There was in the admiral's voice the fudgy caution of a man who knows a slip of the tongue might put him in handcuffs. Before answering questions, he consulted his attorney in whispers that sounded over the radio like the filing of fingernails. We nibbled blueberries on our way back from the graveyard, saving only enough for the next morning's pancakes. I awoke at 6 that morning, our last on Hook Island, and tiptoed outside. A fox had been down our lane, leaving dimpled paw prints in the sand. I followed the tracks from the sand to a field of purple beach peas and salt spray roses, from field to woods of oak and pine, from woods to lane and back again to field and woods. From a hill where cows once grazed and where tufts of rye still grew as a reminder of farms, I could see across half a mile of sandy dunes to the bay. I walked to the shore, past continents of reeds and willow that waved their blonde plumes above my head. Sand lapped over the buckled blacktop of the road. Poison ivy climbed the speed limit signs, and vines gripped the telephone poles. On dunes overlooking the beach, the outermost cottages perched on stilts like flightless and gawky birds that would crash in the first gale. We moved out of the jail after breakfast and joined the Sunday morning crowd of those who had finished their holidays. Those who were just arriving thronged the opposite lane of the highway. Seeing the twin streams of cars, one flowing past us on the way to Mather's Bridge, I could not avoid thinking of other natural passages. The tides, the migration of birds and ducks and seabirds, the arrival and retreat of sunlight. I'm sure this thought occurs to many people each year, stuck in traffic jams on this skinny peninsula in the Hamptons. A craving for escape drives us to these exposed places, and then chains of duty drag us back home. We go and come as though caught in the inhalation and exhalation of a great breath without knowing who or what it is that breathes. Thank you.
Thanks. Am I audible? Okay. I'm going to read rather than make a couple of remarks, as Penn was kind enough to supply me with them. One of Penn's central aims is to foster literary fellowship. In that spirit, each issue of Pan America includes conversations between writers who very often come from countries far apart, but who are united by their love of writing and reading and a belief that literature can speak across cultural and linguistic borders.
In 2006, Penn brought together Edgar Keret from Israel and George Saunders from Chicago. This was an especially felicitous pairing, as I think you'll see, and Pen America published their conversation along with pieces by each writer in their 8th issue. I'm going to read the piece by George first, and then Deborah will read a piece by Edgar. By the way, those of you who read Harper's Magazine may have seen this piece by George Saunders in their August 2008 issue, but those of us who read Pen America got to read it back in March, and here's the pitch. So it pays to subscribe, or even better, to join Pen. Anyway, it's called Realist Fiction. And off script, it's fun to get to read George's work. Last night in a biker bar, I overheard two men discussing what distinguished realist fiction from more experimental work. Although one shouldn't generalize, I never expect bikers to be literary critics. Well, these were literary critics, and good ones. In fact, they'd bought their hogs with royalties from a book they'd co-written, Feminine Desire and Jane Austen. After some verbal sparring, during which they tested my street cred by throwing me out of a window, then torturing me with cigarettes while asking questions about F. Scott Fitzgerald's vision of the fallen American utopia, I explicated my theory of realism to Duke and stud-ass the Gonzo Lithuanian. In realism, I explained, everything happens the way it actually would. The language used is what we in the trade call normal. There is nothing weird about it, no jerking around or making odd surreal crap happen for no reason. A person writing realism writes in the plain old regular words he or she would use when talking to friends or someone really dumb. Realist fiction often involves a central metaphor. Say your story is about a couple who get divorced because the husband is impotent on account of once seeing a fatal farm accident. The central metaphor might be a dead farmer in the yard who, in addition to being dead, is unable to get an erection. Or a field of corn beside the house, and every time the husband walks past, the corn droops. This system of active metaphor helps the reader sense deeper meanings of the story. As the relationship improves, for example, when the wife walks by, the corn stalks instantaneously grow rock hard and several hundred feet tall. Or the farmer could come to life with a big boner and compliment her hair. Duke and Studass were moved by this explanation. George, wow, Duke said. All this time we thought realism required maintaining a modicum of verisimilitude. But what you're suggesting, said Studass, is that the mimesis achieved is only a simulacrum, which creates a diversion, so the central metaphor can more effectively do its imagistic work. Needless to say, I was impressed. These guys were quick. So quick, in fact, that I found myself on Duke's hog, after which I found myself flying through the air into a river. Guys, what the heck, I shouted. We hate you, shouted Studass. Throwing you in the river is a metaphor, shouted Duke. A metaphor for how much we hate you, shouted Studass. Ha ha, you bonehead. Who's the real idiot, I thought as I hit the water. That's not a metaphor at all. It's an objective correlative.
That was great. And I forgot to say, that was Nathan Englander. And I'm Deborah Eisenberg, and I am going to read a story by Edgar Keret. It's actually from the next issue of Pen America, which will come out in the spring, so this is a sneak peek. It's called Rachamim and the Worm Man, an Evil Story. And it was translated from the Hebrew by Sandra Silverstone. I'd like to say I think it's a fabulous translation. Seems like it was written in English. Am I still audible? Okay. The harpsichord in the background was creating some of the most beautiful sounds a Vigdor had ever heard, and the way they intertwined was beyond perfect. "I'm going to cut your ass open," the Worm Man whispered, his voice greasy and sticky. "Why?" a Vigdor asked. "He's asking why," Rachamim said with a snicker, and spat derisively on the gleaming marble floor. "Come here," the Worm Man said, his hand flopping in the air, boneless as an octopus tentacle. What did I do?" a Vigdor stammered. "The man told you to come, so come, ask questions later," Rachamim shouted angrily, the scar on his forehead reddening. A Vigdor approached the Worm Man apprehensively. "Listen, kid, you're still new here. You don't know the rules, so we'll explain them to you very slowly until they sink in." Rachamim smiled an evil smile. "Hold him," the Worm Man ordered in his liquid voice. Rachamim held a Vigdor from behind in an iron grip. The Worm Man moved his spongy face close to a Vigdor's and studied a Vigdor's forehead with his yellow eyes. A Vigdor squirmed wildly in Rachamim's grip. "It won't help you, pal. Me and my friend here cut some real tough guys. Hitler, Genghis Khan, Moses. You think a wimp like you can get away?" "Hitler?" a Vigdor mumbled in a confused voice. "Did you find anything, man?" Rachamim asked his tough partner, completely ignoring a Vigdor. "Shh," the Worm Man whistled as his hand darted into a Vigdor's body, quick as a snake bite, and tore out a chunk of a Vigdor's soul. The torn soul screamed in pain as the quivering lump in the Worm Man's hand tried to get back inside. The Worm Man swallowed the piece of soul greedily, then licked his fingers. A Vigdor gasped. For the first time, he was experiencing a genuine sense of loss and understood what emptiness was. Some of his feelings and memories were being digested now in that disgusting creature's stomach, leaving a Vigdor with the anguish of nothingness. Rachamim let him go, and he landed on the floor like an empty bottle shattering into thousands of pieces. A flute joined the harpsichord now. That glorious duet could have filled a Vigdor with great joy. Unfortunately, the ability to feel joy that a Vigdor once had was lying almost completely digested in the Worm Man's stomach. He wasn't whole. He couldn't even cry. "I'm dead," a Vigdor whispered. "Uh-huh," Rachamim said, nodding. "And this is hell," a Vigdor added. "Hell!" the Worm Man and Rachamim repeated, laughing raucously. "Since when can you find this kind of music in hell? This opulence, this cleanliness?" Rachamim bent over and patted a Vigdor's cheek. "Congratulations, my little tzaddik. You are in heaven." "Our heaven," the Worm Man added in his slurpy voice. Rachamim and the Worm Man walked down the brightly lit aisle, away from a Vigdor. "We'll meet again, pal," Rachamim called out, turning around. and next time it'll be even less pleasant. Bastards, Avidor thought to himself. They took bites of everything, but his fear they left intact. The beautiful music continued to play in the background, and the white walls gleamed spotlessly, except for one piece of wall that had been spray-painted hurriedly in black. Down with integration, send the bad guys back to hell.
I'm André Aciman, and I'm going to read something by Ahmed Ali, which is the pen name of an interpreter and journalist from Iraq. From 2003 to 2006, he worked for Western news organizations, including the Daily Telegraph, CBS, The New Yorker. He fled to Syria in 2006 due to threats against his family. This piece is called Baghdad, Damascus, Atlanta by Ahmed Ali. I was in the green zone covering Saddam's trial when I got a phone call saying my brother-in-law had disappeared. He went to his job and left his 2 kids in the house, and he didn't come back. I tried to call him on his cell phone, but it was switched off. Later, in the offices of the Telegraph, his captors called me using his cell phone. They had abducted my brother-in-law after stopping him at a checkpoint. I tried to introduce myself. We know, they said, you are Ahmed Ali. I asked if they wanted money. No. I asked if I could see my brother-in-law. Don't worry, they said, you will see him at the morgue. But we haven't found the body yet. My wife and I decided to flee with our children to Syria. At first, I was able to continue working for news organizations, CBS, NPR, The New Yorker. But after only 2 months, I was tracked down by Syrian intelligence. They didn't want me, an Iraqi, to get close to the foreigners because I wasn't going to report on the activities of these foreigners to the Syrian government. And they didn't want me telling the foreigners what happens in Syria, which is like Iraq under Saddam. So now we had to leave Syria as well. We would go to the US, but our case needed to be approved, and this took time. We were in Damascus for 1 year and 4 months. I hate waiting. I remember speaking to an Iraqi woman who had decided to go back to Iraq. She had run out of money, and she had to return. I'm heading to hell, she said. I have no other choice. We flew for 3.5 hours to get to Budapest from Damascus. We waited 7 hours at the Budapest International Airport before flying for 9.5 hours to New York. Then we flew to Atlanta. It took 2 weeks to get the necessary documents. Then I was allowed to drive, to take a driving test. I did not know my way around, so someone recommended a GPS navigator. It took nearly an hour to buy the thing, and I wanted to test it out. It was sunset. I suggested to my wife that we have dinner at McDonald's, and I asked the navigator to take us to the nearest one. Wrong route, the device told us, as I tried to leave the shopping compound. I realized that a blue siren was flashing behind me and that I should pull over. Do you know that you ran those lights? The police officer asked. I think so, I said. Why would you do that with kids in the car? The damn device, I said. It keeps telling me the wrong way. You should watch the streetlights first, he said, and then your device. I told him that because I had been to Atlanta less than 3 weeks, I did not know the way. Where are you from? He asked. Iraq, I said. The police officer was surprised. He asked for my driver's license, took it back to his car. Wait here, he told me. What will you do? My wife asked. Nothing, I said. Just wait. The officer came back, asked me how I was able to get my driver's license and the car so quickly. No language barrier, I said. I could see his smile. He said I should be careful, especially when my kids were with me. What now, sir? You're free to go, but I won't let you go if I catch you again. He was about to leave. Please, I asked, could you show us the way to McDonald's? Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Kwame Anthony Appiah. I'm going to read two poems that were published in Pen America 9 by Fadi Judah, who's a Palestinian-American physician. His first poetry collection, The Earth in the Attic, won the Yale Series for Younger Poets competition in 2007. And his poems have appeared in many publications, including Plowshares, Prairie Schooner, and the Kenyan Review. He's been a field member of Médecins Sans Frontières since 2001. And the first poem is called Proof of Kindness. Taxi driver drives through Maine. His plates are legitimate. A father and son in the shadow of snipers. To pray surrounded by guards, to pray to the guards or to the invisible God in the guards or the one surrounding the guards. Among the rubble, I send them caterpillars that eat their mothers and taxed pronouns. Does your house have a gardener? How long around the wall? Our age is a checkpoint. We grieve like palm trees by the river, dance like palm trees by the river. We reach the pigeon coop, check on the pigeons fly. We find a stray puppy. Son calls to the puppy in his enemy's tongue. Taxi exits Broadway. Son poses like a kid in the shadow of snipers. And the second of these poems is called Checkpoint. He diagrams alleys and where houses stood 2 kilometers from the sea. He is two, one who walks his pencil where his feet once walked, and one in the archives of state. There'll be no repatriation, only the ghost of place or a shrine of a holy man who may or may not have passed through the place as wheat or orange groves. Or one with his donkey, and one who holds his cigarette in the web of the 3rd and 4th fingers, and for a while this became the fashion of the young smokers in the camp. To pass, the old man must first kiss his donkey's rump, a show of love to what you love. And he made him sing. I'm the last of the readers this evening, and I was asked just to say, in closing, a little bit about the work of PEN. Mark began by telling you about the many things we do. I'd like to just share with you my theory of what hangs it all together. And that's the fact that the PEN American Center is one of the many PEN centers around the world, which together are organizations of writers and editors who seek to sustain the literary cultures of their own societies and of the global community of writers. So that though we are an organization of writers and editors, we're not for writers and editors, we're for sustaining the literary cultures of the world, and that means we're trying to do this work for everybody. We think that a world in which in which literacy is universal, in which prisoners participate as writers and readers, in which literary culture is protected from government attempts to suppress free expression. We think that such a world is a world eminently worth striving for, because we think that the availability of literary culture, the experience of reading and sharing our responses to reading is one of the great human experiences, one of the things that makes human life worth living. Sometimes it sounds as though when we're protesting the maltreatment of a writer in Kenya or in Turkey or in China or in Burma or in Tibet, sometimes it sounds, or in the United States, by the way, it sounds as though we're just looking after the writers. But we see that as part of the broader project of sustaining, as I say, literary culture in our own society and working with the other PEN centers around the world, sustaining it around the planet. And the magazine that we're here to celebrate this evening, and the magazine that I'm very grateful to you for offering your support to this evening, is part of that attempt to make our contribution to sustaining that literary culture. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for your support for the PEN America magazine. Thank you very much to my fellow writers for reading, and to the writers from whom we read, and to the editors who make this magazine possible. Good night.